Hello there, all my Montville families and friends. This is Miss Jessica doing fairy tale story time again. I hope you've been enjoying my fairy tales that I have been reading to you. This week we are going to do one of our classic fairy tales, Little Red Riding Hood. I'm sure most of you have heard of this book or seen this book, but if you haven't, there's a little girl whose grandmother made her a hoodie cape. So you can see she has it on her head, she has a little cape, and it's red, which is why she's called Little Red Riding Hood. Well, her mom makes her a little basket of goodies, and she has to deliver it to her grandmother's house. But in order to get to her grandmother's house, she has to actually go through the woods. So let's see what happens and who she encounters as she goes through the woods. Okay. Little Red Riding Hood. And here she is. Red was her favorite color, even though her hair was deep red and her cheeks most often a cherry red. Her mother tried to convince her to wear other colors, but red it was, even to the name her friends called her, Red. Her real name, truth to tell, was Millicent, but no one ever called her that, and neither shall we. Red was especially close to her grandmother, who lived a few miles away through a forest lush and deep and dense. Granny was devoted to Red, and as old as she was, visited often. Granny delighted in bringing Red gifts she had made, mittens and slippers and sweaters to wear, cookies and muffins and puddings to eat. But of all these gifts, Red's favorite was a hooded cape of warm wool woven by her grandmother. Needless to say, the cape was as red as a blushing rose. One autumn day, Red's mother told her that Granny was ill and too weak to walk through the woods alone. "I've readied a basket of bread and cakes for you to take to dear Granny," said her mother. "Go there directly and don't stray from the path, and be home before dark." Red was always in bed by dusk, so it never occurred to her to be by herself in the woods at night. She ran to get her hooded cape and returned to her mother. "Remember what I said," her mother said. "Straight to Granny's, no delay, and mind your manners while you're there." "Oh, I will, Mother," Red replied. Her thoughts strayed to her ailing grandmother and to the woods she had never been through alone. And then off she went, wrapped in her red cape. On the bridge at the edge of town, she met the village woodsman. "Where does the road take you, Little Red?" "To Granny's with food to make her well." "Take care you don't leave the path," he warned. "Danger is lurking behind every leaf." Red nodded and smiled, staring ahead at the towering trees, but she didn't really hear the woodsman's warnings. Before he could continue, though, she was skipping along the path and into the woods. The woodsman watched her go and wished her well. Deeper into the woods Red walked, marveling at the magnificent foliage and breathing in the cool, damp air that surrounded her. And always she stayed on the path. Rounding the bend, she came upon a sharp-looking fellow leaning against a tree. Here it is. Looks like a big wolf. He fairly glowed with his silver fur coat and his dark gleaming eyes. He was a wolf, and he had been watching her for some time. Now Red had never met a wolf before, and she hadn't even heard of one. "Oh, how handsome he is," Red thought, trying not to stare. The wolf looked her over with a steady gaze and then tickled her and terrified her all at once. "What a beautiful cape," purred the wolf. "Blood red, my favorite shade," he smiled. "And what a beautiful girl wearing it." Red blushed so deeply that it was hard to tell where she left off and her cape began. "Have we met before?" asked the wolf. "I think not. I surely would remember such a savory rosebud, one with such delicious taste and clothes. The wolf smiled again. Oh, look at those teeth. Red smiled back. Thank you, she whispered, and she curtsied as her mother had taught her. What's in the basket? He inquired. Bread and cakes to take to my granny. Delicious, smiled the wolf. But what a long trip for such a tender tulip. Oh no, Red protested. Granny's house is just past the Cyrus Grove. The wolf could barely curb his appetite. He was tempted to wolf her down right then. But then he said, why settle for a single course? Why not get both of them? First, a little bit of dried granny aged on the bone, and then this apple dumpling for dessert. He wants to eat both of them. He said aloud to her, You'd best hurry along then. Granny craves a crust of bread, and, he hesitated, she always likes some wildflowers. I'll give him a little bit more time. The color drained from Red's cheeks, though not from her cape. But I don't have wildflowers. No choked the wolf. Red shook her head. He paused. Oh, perhaps she'll be too tasteful to notice. Oh, a tear welled up in Red's eye. Oh, now, my dumpling. There's no need for that, comforted the wolf. Just look around you. Wildflowers. There's wildflowers everywhere. And the farther from the path you go, the more succulent the buds. Oh, thank you, Sir, Red said, because whatever succulent was, Granny, she was sure would like it. So off the path she stepped, plucking flower after flower, all the while going farther into the woods and farther from the path. Uh-oh. The wolf ran straight to Granny's house and knocked on the door. Who is it? Rasped Granny, unable to pull herself out of bed. Taking a deep breath and putting on his most innocent, girlish voice, the wolf replied, Oh, it's Red, Granny. I've brought you luscious bread and cakes to make you well. Do you have a cold, my dear? Asked Granny. You sound so hoarse. And the wolf coughed. Will you let me in? He asked. Just lift the latch and let yourself in, my dear. So lift the latch he did, and in one bound he leapt on Granny, lapped her up, and licked his lips. The gulf had swallowed the sweet old lady in one greedy gulp. Ah, he sighed, sinking back onto Granny's pillows. Then, with a plan that he had concocted as he was chatting with Red, he put on the Granny's nightcap and went around closing the shutters. Oh, so look right there in the bed. That's the wolf. That's not Granny. Just when Red arrived outside, her arms overflowing with all manner of dazzling wildflowers, she was surprised to see the door open. But she peered inside the darkened house and called out softly, Granny, are you there? And in reply, she heard a deep but delicate cough. Oh my, she thought, how sick Granny must be. Feeling frightened, Red approached the bed. Usually a visit to Granny made her happy, but she was very uneasy. And in the dim light, she saw Granny lying in bed, her nightcap pulled over her face. She looks odd, thought Red. The wolf coughed delicately again and pulled the covers up around his chin. Why, Granny, said Red, what big arms you have. The better to hug you with, whispered the wolf. Oh, look at that. Stepping closer to the bed, Red noticed the wolf's ears peeking through Granny's nightcap. "Why, Granny," said Red, "what big ears you have!" "The better to hear you with," whispered the wolf. Still closer, Red saw a familiar and unsettling gleam in Granny's eyes. "Why, Granny, what big eyes you have!" "The better to see you with," whispered the wolf. By now, Red was close enough to see the wolf's magnificent molars, the teeth. As he spoke, "Why, Granny, what big teeth you have!" "The better to eat you with," roared the wolf. And in one bound, he leapt on Red, lapped her up, and licked his lips. He had swallowed the lovable little girl in just one gulp. "Ah," he said, rubbing his tummy, and he sunk right back into Granny's pillows, and in no time at all, he was sound asleep and snoring. Shh. Just then, the village woodsman happened to be hiking by. He heard the dreadful sound coming from inside Granny's house and saw the door open. Remembering Red's visit, he rushed inside and found the sleeping wolf in Granny's nightclothes. Now the woodsman could tell a week-old woman from a wicked wolf, so he raised the axe over his head, intending to do away with this outlaw in Granny garb. But suddenly he noticed the wolf's stomach. It was twitching and twirling, as if there was something in the stomach. The woodsman put down his axe. He took out a knife and he made a little slit into the stomach. And as he did so, he saw a familiar red cape appear deep inside the wolf. So he reached in and he pulled Red out. "Ooh," said Red. It was dark and slimy in there. The woodsman comforted her. "You can't stop," she said. "Granny's in there too." So the woodsman cut a little bit more and pulled Granny out, and she was alive. Red helped the woodsman gather several heavy stones, and they put the stones in the wolf's stomach. When the wolf woke up, he tried to run away, but all he could do was drag himself to the door. Because he doesn't have Granny and Little Red in there anymore. Now he has big stones in his tummy. Red stayed with Granny a few days and nursed her back to health. Then the woodsman, wearing his new silver fur coat, escorted Red back home. And she has never, ever, to this day, wandered from the path again. And there we go. Granny is all better. And there's the woodsman and Little Red going back home. And luckily she has a grown-up to get her back home again. The end. Happily ever after. I hope you enjoyed that story of Little Red Riding Hood. That's an old, old tale. A lot of people like telling about it. I'm glad everything turns out okay. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that story for this week. That's Miss Jessica's Fairy Tale Story Time. And I hope that soon you'll be coming to visit the library and I could say hello to you. Bye, everybody.